Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Build Amazing Things Securely. I'm Laura Belmain, your host, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. We've got the CEO of Castlepoint with us, Rachael Greaves, and she is a specialist in an area that not many of us actually get to think about. But I'm going to let her introduce that because I think, otherwise we'll spoil the surprise. But before we begin, as we always do, firstly, Rachael, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be here.
Awesome. Now, we're really lucky to have Rachael today because normally she's hanging out in the UK, which means it's really awful times of day to record things. But for reasons, she happens to be in Australia right now. So we are making the most of it. So, Rachael, as we have you here, who are you as a human?
Well, we've got my name, which is Rachael Greaves, which is a good start. And that's number one, how we categorise people and who they are on the electoral roll. I am Australian, even though I do live in the UK most of the time. And I am the CEO of Castlepoint Systems, which is a company that I am co-founder of with my husband, actually. In terms of background, obviously raised in Australia, but lived in the UK quite a bit as a kid. And I'm back there now with my own kids. And went to university, studied classics, so Latin,
Nice.
ancient Greek, ancient history, and anthropology. I've got a degree in anthropology and ended up in IT in a reasonably roundabout way, as we do. In terms of credentials, since that degree and during my career, I've become a certified auditor, so I'm a CISA, and a security manager. I'm a CISM. And I'm certified in privacy, and I'm a certified records manager, which I think is probably what you're alluding to with the topic that we don't usually talk about, but I think we should talk about more.
Absolutely. Now, I'm absolutely delighted that you did classics at university. I think one of the things we're learning with all our guests is that it really is no cookie cutter pattern to what makes you good at what you do. Education is a starting point, but it's not the final destination. And plus, also, classics is pretty cool. So tell us, what is a records keeper, Rachael? What is even, do you have a sword? Is it that kind of thing?
Well, yeah, I mean, records managers are a very diverse group of people, which obviously includes me as one with my security background, but also includes other people with lots of transferable skills from other domains as well. And records managers have had more and less importance over time, culturally and from a regulatory point of view. But I mean, records managers are having a bit of a moment. It could be records managers that send Donald Trump to prison in the US. So the importance of records management from an anthropological perspective seems to fluctuate over time with other cultural factors as well. But at the moment, we're quite important to social fabric and to preserving history, particularly in the face of changes in technology like AI, which really are a kind of a new risk to our culture and our cultural identity.
Awesome. Now, I'd love to kind of give a bit of exposure to what you're doing in this space, because you're more than just an auditor, right, Rachael? You're a founder or co-founder with your husband. So what is Castlepoint? What are you doing?
Yeah, well, from the audit background, what we started doing back in about 2012 when we founded our company was auditing information governance compliance. So I'm the kind of above the line auditor of the family and of the company. I'm the specialist in policy and regulation and knowing what all the rules are in terms of how we have to protect information, preserve it, and destroy it when it reaches its retention period. And Gavin, my husband and my co-founder, is the sort of below the line auditor, a really experienced architect. So we would be engaged by mostly federal government, predominantly the Department of Defence in Australia, but lots of other agencies as well, to really look into why these initiatives for information governance were failing, and sometimes very expensively, and very consistently and predictably and repeatably failing. And what became pretty clear was that despite best intentions, and honestly, whatever kind of conspiracy theory you want to believe in, government conspiracy to do the wrong thing shouldn't be one of them, because I can attest as an auditor that almost everybody there is trying to do the right thing. Despite that, real intention to do the right thing and follow the rules and protect and preserve information, everyone was failing really for the same reasons, and there was no way for them to succeed. So it became pretty clear that we needed to come up with a way to succeed. We had to come up with a new kind of technology, and not just kind of a new, a new tin to put the same tech in, but a completely new category of information governance technology, which is what we designed. So Castlepoint's what's known as a kind of a category defining tech. It's an artificial intelligence capability that does exactly what a human would do if a human had time to read every word in every document, email, database, chat message, web page, ticket in the whole enterprise, on-prem and cloud, and work out not just what it is and where it is, but what it's about. When we know what it's about, we know how to classify it, and therefore we know how to treat it. So what our product really is auto classification capability.
I'm a bit of a data nerd, but this is, it's mind blowing really when you think about the scale of what you're doing here, Rachael. So, I've done large government organisation in the UK. I've done smaller organisations. I've done big multinationals. And when any of us try and think about how much data, how much in terms of documents and interactions we're having, I don't think any of us can really appreciate the scale of what that is.
Yeah.
So how many documents I'm going to get the terminology wrong, you correct me, Rachael, but how many items are we processing for an average organization using Castlepoint?
Well, I mean, hundreds of millions and billions. And the problem we have with that as humans is that, of course, number one, we can't possibly know what all that is. Like, it's such a high volume, but it's also a huge variety of information, and no one person can understand all of it. And it's enormous velocity, like it's constant change. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of it, I mean, we did a little bit of a calculation recently for a particular purpose, and what we found is that across our client base, and we've been providing this capability for about 5 years now, and it's pretty broadly used across government and corporates. But when you benchmark across all of those, about 15% of what people manage is Word documents and PDFs, only 15%. But in that 15%, there are billions and billions and billions of words in that content in the environment. And humans aren't really good at understanding exponentials. Like, it's very hard to conceive of a billion, which makes it hard sometimes to get across really what this scale means. But if you think about that, that's up to today. When people are creating documents, emails constantly, like most of the intellectual property we have and most of the assets we have are digital in an organization. They're people's effort to come up with ideas and write them down. When we start to introduce generative AI, which we're now seeing, a document that would have taken an individual hours or days or weeks to write can be produced in seconds or minutes. So we're about to see the volume increase to another exponential that we've never had to deal with before, just simply because of how fast it's going to be to create that content. We're taking off the limiters of how fast people can type and really blowing a hole in the whole idea.
This is awesome. This is blowing my mind a little bit because I don't think I'd really thought about generative AI in that way. There's a lot of conversations. We're all listening and watching them about, intellectual property and this, that, and the other. But nobody's talking about the sheer scale and volume of noise, of documents, of things that are going to come out of this. Yeah. That's incredible. Now, I'm interested in your experience, Rachael, because we've known each other a couple of years, and a couple of years ago, generative AI was not a widely known thing, but you were already there. So you've already kind of crossed over some of the kind of the territory with putting AI into systems. And not only are you using AI, but you're using it over hundreds of millions of documents in very sensitive environments. Yeah. What have you learned on the way about, putting AI into those environments and for those purposes?
Yeah, there's maybe three main things that you learn. The first thing you learn is the actual material harm that is possible when you manage information incorrectly, which we can come back to. And the second thing you learn is the scale. no one conceives, no one believes that they have this much sensitive information or this much high value information in their environment. But, just over the government clients that we've found something like 250 million individual instances of sensitive personal information in those environments. And there's no way those organizations would have thought that they had that much stuff. There is so much dark data, and we all know dark data is a concept, but you just can't conceive of the scope and the scale of it until you actually start evidencing it, you start quantifying it. And the third thing that we've learned and we've seen in practice is how important explainability is, how important ethical AI is and is going to be. They're really the three main things that everyone now has to grapple with when we're talking about AI for information classification.
Let's come back to two of these. I'm going to come back to the ethical side and the explainability. But first, you talked about harm, and I don't think many of us have a model mentally of how harm would really work. I know we've seen data breaches before, but we haven't seen really how could this hurt a person. Have you got some stories you could share?
Yeah, so many. And a lot of the audits that I did aren't public domain, so I can't talk about them. But when we were conceiving of the product, obviously we were informed by those experiences. As an auditor, I've been responsible for the cancellation of multi-billion-dollar programs of work and all that money kind of getting flushed away. That's a kind of harm at a societal level, right? We can't be wasting billions of dollars like that as a government for our society. But there's harm to individuals as well. So when we started looking at, what can go wrong and really understanding a business case for why we should even build a product for this, we looked at some other public domain examples of things that had gone wrong. And the first one that really resonated with me and made me fully commit to abandoning my life as a well-remunerated consultant and becoming a founder was the story of Vivian Salon. So Vivian is an Australian citizen, a very vulnerable woman found with a head injury in a park in Lismore, and picked up, by the police and then handed to the Department of Immigration, who summarily deported her to the Philippines because they couldn't find her record in their record-keeping system. And an inquiry found that, of course, the record was there the whole time. The system was just not discoverable. So this very vulnerable citizen was sent to Manila and left in a home for the dying and destitute for many years until she was tracked down by a Good Samaritan and repatriated to Australia and compensated. But she had left her little kid at childcare that day, never picked him up. And he was put into the foster system where he remained even after she returned, as far as we're aware. So that's catastrophic harm to one person that has a ripple effect to the rest of their family and their wider community because we just couldn't find some information. And it's not a one-off. The same thing happened with Cornelia Rao, locked in immigration detention because her records couldn't be related across systems. And in the UK, an inquiry found that if the national policing database was more discoverable, was actually discoverable at all, really, then the Manchester bombing would have been prevented.
Oof, wow.
Not could have been, but definitely would have been. There were 400 pieces of missed information in that system that would have prevented that attack. So, and that's just discoverability, right? When we can't find things, these are the catastrophic outcomes that can happen. And whether we're a government or a corporate, we're just the custodians of information that's about people. And they're really the owner of that information, but we're trusted with the custody of it. And if we make mistakes like that, that can really cause a lot of harm. We have harm too when we destroy things that should be kept, like we saw with the Windrush generation in the UK, where the government destroyed all the arrival cards of Caribbean immigrants from the Windrush era, which meant that when the hostile environment policy was introduced and those people had to furnish proof of their right to remain in the UK, they couldn't because the only record from those ships of them arriving had been destroyed. And technically those records had reached their minimum retention. They didn't need to be kept anymore, but they should have been, because a rule about how long we keep things needs to be considered in context of all the other legislation, So again, dozens of people were unlawfully deported because of that. So that's just destroying information too soon. And then, of course, with breaches, we see what happens when we keep information too long, when we don't minimise. And suddenly when there's a spill, all these people are affected that shouldn't have been in the spill. Their information should have been disposed of securely and compliantly when it no longer had a business use. So all of these things, how we manage information can cause such significant harm that we actually responded to the Australian government, consultation paper on responsible AI last week. I think it closed, to say that use of AI for information management should be considered high risk, because when we use automated decision making for whether we protect or preserve or destroy something, that can have irreversible and permanent effects on citizens.
Yeah, and if we think about this as software engineers, right? I've built systems of all kinds before. Most of our audience have. We talk about impact, and we talk about it in quite a high level sense. I don't think any of us really dig into that impact. And I certainly don't think that we think about those environments we're putting in and those real long-lasting effects of our decisions. And I wonder if we would change the way that we build software or that we design it if we were thinking in quite that coordinated way. And particularly, we talk a lot about legislation, and I'm glad you brought that up, about retention periods. Now, retention periods are interesting in that they describe the minimum amount that you can keep it for, but they don't describe the maximum. And like you said, they're isolated to a specific set of requirements. They're not a coordinated piece. And when you start trying to map out, I've tried recently, don't do it, to map out all of the application security requirements, for example, across multiple schemas, it's a nightmare of a job. It's no wonder that we have this fragility in our data handling. And perhaps for our audience at home, that's something you can have a think about, is think about these use cases, these scenarios that Rachael shared with us. And what are the impacts that your data could have if it was not discoverable, or if it was deleted prematurely or mishandled? So these sound like amazing technical challenges, Rachael. And you talked a little bit earlier. You said that your AI should be explainable, that it should have a transparency to it. I'm going to get the wrong words, but can you talk us through that? What does that really mean if your AI is explainable in some way?
Yeah, so maybe the best way to understand this is, again, with some examples. So Australians are familiar with robo-debt at this point, hopefully, and that wasn't AI, right, but it was an algorithm. It was an algorithm that said this person owes money and sent letters to those people and said you have a big debt. And the problem with that was twofold. The first problem was that the algorithm was wrong in a lot of cases, which is not good. But the second problem was that it wasn't really contestable. So when people tried to push back, again, vulnerable people, the most vulnerable people in the community are the ones who are receiving benefits, right? The most disenfranchised people with the fewest resources. So when they tried to push back and said, I don't think this is right, they were met with this wall of resistance that said the algorithm is right. The algorithm says so. Computer says, yes, you owe money. And there was no way to contest that and argue with it. And that's what really caused the hardship and the harm. And again, that wasn't a one-off. And this has been happening for a long time. This goes back to the 90s with the Horizon scandal in the UK with the postmasters, where Fujitsu, I think it was, had the Horizon system set up with an algorithm that was incorrectly determining that postmasters were stealing from their own post offices. Oh, wow. And a lot of people were fired. Some people, I believe, were actually imprisoned. People lost their livelihoods. Their marriages broke down because, again, this algorithm was wrong. But more importantly, it wasn't contestable. So when they went back and said, can you explain this algorithm? The answer was, no, not really. Like, it's an algorithm. What do you want me to say? So since then, we've had this voluntary code of ethical AI. ethical artificial intelligence. And Australia was actually one of the first jurisdictions in the world to have a formal kind of code of conduct for ethical AI. And the principles of ethical AI are the same the world over. It's that when we use algorithms or any automated decision making, you need to be able to explain that decision so that people can contest it. That's all. It's really that simple. So they use words like transparency, explainability, explicability, whatever that is. But the whole concept essentially is that if we're going to rely on algorithms and AI, which based on our earlier discussion of scope and scale, clearly we have to, those outputs, the decisions that come from that, you need to be able to contest them if you think they're wrong.
Awesome. So if I'm understanding this correctly, it's the idea that you've not just got the output, but also this kind of dialogue, if you will, that says we got to this via this process. And those two things happen in combination. We're used to just looking at the outputs. You've been playing with ChatGPT, you see the output of it, but you're not seeing the inner working, that like maths papers when you did exams when you were young and showing your working was important.
Exactly.
We're going to be really pushing to show the working.
That's right. And it's the same with any kind of science, right? So this is why we have peer review. You can't just come out with an output. You need to show your data. You need to show how the decision was arrived at so that it can be scrutinized. And if it's wrong, it can be caught. Otherwise, we end up with vaccines cause autism, right? Because we don't do enough due diligence on how someone arrived at a conclusion. And that in itself can cause a lot of harm for individuals and for wider society. So this was all just voluntary codes. And luckily, because I'm an auditor, when I designed the software, of course, I went looking for any kind of international standard, benchmark, best practice to apply, anything relating to what we were doing. And of course, Australia had these ethical AI principles. So I baked them in from the beginning. I said, okay, if we're going to do this AI and it's going to have the ability to read everything in the environment and it's going to classify it automatically, it must be transparent. We have to be able to show not just the decision support of saying, hey, this record is ready for disposal or this one is risky or this one is valuable. We need to be able to show clearly in the user interface in simple language why it's reached that conclusion so that you can decide whether it's right or it's wrong. So we built that in from the beginning. But we were really the only ones doing that with AI at the time because it's much easier to just use something like machine learning, where you just train the AI on a data set and say, okay, well, here's a rule. We need to keep final approved versions of asbestos remediation policy for 15 years, whatever. So what you're saying when you use supervised machine learning, for example, is you're saying, okay, give me 1,000 good examples of final approved versions of asbestos remediation policy. That's hard to do, right? But let's say you could curate that many, gold examples of that. Then the AI reads them all and it makes patterns and vectors and it goes, okay, I've learned this. I now know what this is, which means when I find it later, I'll be able to know based on my algorithm that this is a final approved version of asbestos remediation policy, which is a great theory except for two problems. Number one is the scale. So the rules for how we manage information are plentiful and often conflicting. And those rules come from all different kinds of legislation. So your average organisation will have hundreds or even thousands of separate rules. So that's a lot of work, right, to set it up. It's very high effort to do this well, to actually get good quality source data to train it on. But the bigger problem is that even if you could do that and you were really confident that your source data was perfect and that you'd supervised the ML really effectively, when you start getting outcomes, they're algorithmic. They're from a closed box or what we used to call a black box system, which means that you just have to trust it. And when someone comes and says, hey, you destroyed my file, which had the information that I need to be eligible for compensation or eligible for reparations, as in the case of Maralinga or stolen generations in Australia or child abuse, it's not good enough to just say, yeah, but the algorithm said we could destroy it. Because you can't break open that closed box. You can't see why. And that's not good enough anymore under law. So since ChatGPT came and frightened everybody in the world, at the same time as we have, a war happening in Europe, everyone started to take this ethical AI much more seriously. And now it's becoming law. So the EU have put down the Ethical AI Act for short, which should be coming into effect pretty soon, and every other advanced economy is following, including Australia now. So soon it will become actually against the law to make these algorithmic closed box decisions that can impact people. So that puts us in a good position because we sort of forecast this would happen a long time ago when it was still voluntary. But what it does mean is that any other AI that you're using in any automated decision making, which could be generative, it could be large language models, it could be supervised machine learning, it could be neural networks, is about to be obsolesced by this law. So we're going to have to really, come to terms with and reconcile what we do with the AI that we've already adopted to see if it's going to be lawful to use going forward.
I think this is a very interesting time. It's interesting for security nerds like me. We struggle with these closed black box systems because threat assessment is really impossible when you can't see what a thing is doing on the inside. But if you're building a system now, anyone in the audience, and you have an AI component, and perhaps you sell globally, this is going to be a really interesting time full of some very big technical challenges. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting watching going on of the EU situation and how that rolls out globally. And hopefully it will be seen as a positive thing long term, and that, we can embrace the benefits that it gives us and that harm reduction that you've spoken so eloquently about today, Rachael. Look, I'm genuinely excited to hear about what your technology is doing. I wouldn't even know where to begin at that scale. And so what's the best way for us to follow along the Castlepoint adventure and what you're doing, Rachael?
Yeah, well, we're on LinkedIn. Castlepoint Systems is the company. You can find us on there. And the website's castlepoint.systems. Heaps of info on there about what we're doing. And I always welcome people connecting with me directly on LinkedIn. Rachael Greaves, you'll have the spelling in the podcast there. I love to just stay part of the community, and keep an eye on what's going on. So please connect with me directly and follow the company page, and you'll hear all about what we're doing.
Awesome. That sounds great. And for those who are new to this ethical AI space, it feels like we all have a bit of reading and a bit of homework to do. So let's all share those links. Remember to like and subscribe and all of those kind of things for the podcast, and share what you learned. Did you find something out today as a result of today's episode? Are you rethinking the way that you do some form of AI? Because I'd really love for us to make that more visible, more transparent. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Rachael. I've learned a whole bunch. I now have more questions. So that's a perfect place to leave a podcast episode. But good luck with all of your adventures. We wish you all the best.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, that's been another fantastic episode, team. I hope you've enjoyed it. And as always, if you have anyone else you would like to see us interview on the show, or if you're personally involved in building some amazing technology or solving a big technical problem we're not even aware of, then get in touch. We'd love to talk.